Hi, we continue in Genesis 35 today, starting with verse 8, where the enigmatic verse about a character we've not seen before, at least not named before. Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died. Of whatever cause we don't know, but there it is, and that's all we hear about it. So as we enter into this section of chapter 35, we have to note that the first part that we looked at last video, 35, 1-7, forms this nice tight chiasm that you can see there and that we explored last time. But we've also been looking at it as the conclusion of the section that begins in 33:18, so that we couldn't read chapter 34 apart from the parallel introduction and ending that had a number of words and images that connected it, to show us that that was really what the unit was. And as I've been noting throughout, the chapter and verse markers are from the medieval era to help copyists in monasteries know where they were. They're not part of the original. So in many ways we could say that verse 8 is the beginning of a new unit, certainly separate from what we see here and separate from the earlier story, although Bethel will be noted below, and El will continue to be the name of God throughout this chapter. There are many differences. And one of them is that there seems to be a jumble of just little pieces. So we have this one verse about Deborah, as I noted. Then we see 3 different times the narrator tells us that El, or God, if you will, but if you want to know why I have El, watch the last video where I explain that in more detail, that El appeared to Jacob here, and then El said to him, and then El said to him in 3 consecutive verses. When the narrator does that, that tends to mean either, as scholars who are source-oriented think, that there's an insertion from a different source, or that it's a time indicator, that each time that God, in the form of El or Yahweh, is named separately, that's indicating it's a separate event. And yet no time is named to connect or disconnect these things. There's just simply this statement, as we see, that God said, God said. And so one of the questions is, especially given that what we hear in this paragraph we're going to look at are things we've heard before, either addressed to Abraham, as we see here from chapter 17, as we'd already seen the circumcision issue in chapter 34 from 17, but also the echoes of the end of chapter 18 that we see here in chapter 28, 18, and 19. And really, not just an echo in the sense it's remembering it, but it seems like he's doing the same thing again there, pouring oil on an altar, but it's not in the same location, and that's one of the key differences. And we'll also note there are a number of location elements here, and although for readers of Genesis on its own, that doesn't mean that much, and we can look at the atlas and see where some of those are. And so he's come from Sukkoth, where he built the house there, and then to Shechem, where we had the incident that we saw with Dinah, of course, and now he's at Bethel, and now on the way down to Bethlehem and Jerusalem into this area. So what we're seeing is he's crossed from the other side of the Jordan into the land of Israel, or is it the land of Benjamin? And that's going to be one of the issues we're going to look at briefly, both in this video and the next one. We'll look at it in more detail, as we'll see. And so perhaps part of what's at issue in all these these space references without a time reference to all these places has to do with something in the exilic period. Is Benjamin part of Israel? Is Israel part of Judah? Are they all one, or are they separate? And so there's a number of elements of that we'll look at and scholars have looked at. And again, I'm not going the source-oriented route, so I will not be exploring the possibility that these are different pieces from different times inserted back into Genesis. My view has always been all along that whatever the sources might have been, somebody put it in the order we have it, and that was the intention, to read it as a unit as we have it. And so that's what we're doing. Not to omit the reality when we can sometimes see it that there are anachronistic elements throughout. Another thing that we're seeing here is there are a number of deaths. So Deborah dies here, as we see. We'll see in the next video that Rachel dies here. And at the very end of the story, Isaac dies, and Jacob and Esau come together, surprisingly, to bury him. So a lot of life and death and a lot about places. In many ways, we can see this as an epilogue, that after the drama of the story is ended, and although it's dramatic for Rachel, since she dies here, Jacob has no response at all other than a different name, and there's no discussion between them. So in many ways, it's a very low-key summary, both of the entire Jacob story, as we've been seeing here, as it links back to the very beginning of the story in this pattern, but also to the Abraham story. And some scholars have even gone so far as to suggest that Jacob as Israel was the original, and Abraham was added later to appease people in Judah. If Jacob is Mr. Israel, Abraham would be Mr. Judah, but we do not need to go down that path. What I would like to go down to bring another element into this is this little chart that shows this connection here between a number of the images and words here in our section. This is in 34, this is in 35, and this is in 35, with the story of the rape of Levite's secondary wife, often labeled concubine, but I won't call it that, to our story here. And so we can see it starts with the sons of Israel, and most translations are described as Israelites, but literally they're the sons of Israel, exactly parallel to the sons of Jacob. And we see there that one of them is a Levite. Notice that these are not in order. I put them in the order they match Genesis, but this is chapter 20, this is 21, and this is 19, all part of the same story. So there's a Levite here residing in the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim, and Rachel here will give birth to Benjamin some distance from Ephraim. And we see here that the issue is Ephraim, Bethlehem, and Judah, which also echoes into the book of Ruth of Ephraim, Bethlehem, and Judah as Ephraimites. But we note in the video, on the section we'll look at in the video next time, Genesis 35 describes Ephrath is Bethlehem. And so there's some question of what the relationship is there, and what the relationship is with the people and place of Benjamin. And the link that I want to note here is right here in verse 8. And it may well be that verse 8 is here for this very reason. So calling this place where she's buried Alon Bakuth, Alon being the name of the kind of tree. The North Sea translates it oak here as Alon, but back in 12:6 is translated oak, and it's a different word there, so a different species, sometimes translated terebinth. But either way, Alon is the word for this here. So Alon Bakuth, the terebinth, or the oak of weeping. It doesn't say who's calling it that. And it doesn't say there was any weeping here. There's just obviously the weeping by somebody associated with her dying. But notice, as far as we can tell, she dies alone. It doesn't say that Jacob was with her, and Rebekah's obviously not here, but it doesn't say any of the other women. There are the 4 wives of Jacob, and you think they might be mentioned in connection with Deborah, who's described after all as Rebekah's nurse, which is ambiguously whether the one who nursed her as a baby or the one who nursed her babies. We saw the reference to her as nurse way back here in 24:59, when Abraham's servant had gone to the house of Laban and brought her back to be the wife of Isaac. But we did not see a name for her there. But now we have a name for her, Deborah. And she's the only Deborah here. And as Sarna notes, perhaps Deborah traditions known to the audience, or perhaps a way of showing that, quote, the purging of idolatry and the arrival of Bethel, the context with Mesopotamia, are finally and definitively severed. The mention of the death of Deborah thus becomes appropriate here, for she was a living symbol of that connection. As someone, which to say, as someone who came from the old country. But of course, Rachel and Leah came from the old country too, so I'm not sure that really works. We will see, though, that one of the interesting connections is Benjamin is born here. The people of Benjamin in this place are wiped out there. And at the end of the David story, that begins with Saul going to Rachel's tomb at Benjamin, we'll find out, and you can see it in my David series, that in 2 Samuel 6, Saul's daughter Michal, who is David's wife, never will have a child with him, ending the line of the Benjaminites, the royal line of Benjaminites through David. And then also in 2 Samuel, David takes care of any remaining male members of the Saul family whose children are not allowed to continue on. So Benjamin as a tribe begins here, and at least as a royal people, it ends in the story of David, which is connected right here, as we can see, that flows from the end of the book of Ruth, because the end of the book of Ruth is a little genealogy that leads to David, and 1 Samuel, in the order we have the biblical books, is what follows right after Ruth. So all that we can see connected to this verse right here. And it may be that this verse, although it doesn't fit in much into the narrative context, is there to stimulate all this kind of thought that we can see. So let's go back to our keywords, and we'll follow through the next piece of it. And notice again the point I was making earlier, that when did these things happen? It says God appeared to Jacob again compared to what? When he came from Paddan Aram, which is to say when he was leaving Laban behind, before he had reconnected with his brother Esau back in chapter 32. So that was then. So is this recalling something then? Or is this saying that he'd come from Paddan Aram this entire time and this is a new appearance? Either way, whether it's recalling something there or here, it's repeating this experience that certainly came from Paddan Aram, but as we saw was at the end of the wrestling scene when the anonymous person he wrestles with changes his name. Here it's explicitly God, but there it was ambiguous, and of course here there's no wrestling. So source-oriented people want to argue here that this is a retelling by a different source or that kind of thing, but we don't need to hear it that way. For example, as we see below, Sarna reads it this way. The previous naming of Jacob as Israel was made on the other side of the Jordan at Penuel. Quote, therefore, the new name Israel needs to be confirmed and validated by God himself in the promised land. And that's why I was showing you the geography of that. And that's certainly a reasonable claim there. Listening to the language of it, your name is Jacob, no longer shall you be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name, so he was called Israel. And notice here that I've noted that the Hebrew for name, Shem, is so close to the Hebrew for there, Sham, that I wanted to highlight that it's 4 times in this verse, along with the repeated use of the word call, and we see that a couple of times. So a number, call here. So just clustered into this little section. It's not exactly a key word in the chapter, but it is right in this section. So called it Bethel, called it Alan Bakun, called him Israel, right in that section. So all those namings here. So the no longer shall be called Jacob, but the narrator will call him Jacob right in verse 14, which is seemingly suggesting this is something from a different time in the future, that your name should be called Israel later, or perhaps referring more to the people of Israel, although the human being Jacob will be called Israel in the Joseph story, as we'll see. So Israel shall be your name here, confirming 32:28. Zakovich notes the alternative tradition in Deuteronomy and Isaiah of Yeshurun in place of Israel. We can look at one example here from 32:15. So you see that there, Jacob ate his fill, Jeshurun grew fat and kicked. We'll also see later that another alternative is Ephraim, who's the name of one of the children born to Joseph in Egypt. But that's for later in the story. So he was called Israel here, and this is omitted from the Septuagint. The Septuagint translators seeming to make it clear this is repetition that they didn't need to include. And then God says to him again, and it doesn't say again, and this is obviously not connected to the previous scene, but connected to the early part of Genesis, back in the creation story in chapter 1, as we see here. Also in the midst of the flood story, as the waters come down, and then after the flood story. But also, of course, to Abraham around nations and people shall spring from you. But here it's El Shaddai. So we've been seeing El throughout here, and here El Shaddai is to say El Almighty. And we see also how that frames with 28:3. Let's go back to that to see for a moment. This was the promise that his father Isaac made to him. May El Shaddai bless you and make you fruitful and numerous, that you may become a company of people. And certainly that's exactly what we're seeing fulfilled here. And I didn't happen to put the 28:3 connection there, but that's just another of the many I could have put there. So a nation and a company of nations, and we can see down below that's understood through Rashi that Benjamin is a nation, and the Egyptian children, as I was just mentioning, Ephraim, but also Manasseh, can be seen as a company of nations. The word for company is quahal, which is often the word that refers to Israel as a whole, the whole community of Israel when all the tribes are together. As Lee notes below, there are no apparent indications in the Pentateuch or in the history of Israel in the Old Testament of the fulfillment of a company of nations coming from Israel, hence the Midrash seeing it as Ephraim and Manasseh alone. Shall come from you, and we note a birth oracle here, but kings shall spring from you. Although Zakovich suggests this offers an alternative etymology that hides the image of the physical wrestling with the divine, replacing sarim for wrestling with melachim, it could be that this is anticipating David. Whether that's to be seen positive or not is hard to say. But to the extent that in a moment Benjamin is to come forth and then and be an Ephrathite, and then we see that here that's where David was the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem, which is where we see that Benjamin is born here. Perhaps there's meant to be some connection from that. The word for the phrase from spring from here, halatzaim here, only here in the Pentateuch, and it's key in another place where Solomon is speaking about himself, about an oracle anticipated that the one who would spring from David would build the temple. And so whether it's referring to this particular place, it's hard to know, but it's the only places in the Deuteronomistic history, so that may well be. And so, from kings and companies coming from you to land. Notice how each verse has a whole different topic. And the land image, as we've seen, echoes from 17:8. Exactly that. The land promised to Abraham and Isaac is now promised to be given to him. And then it says God went up from him at the place where he had spoken to him. And notice how this phrase is repeated 3 times here. 3 times in 3 verses. Went up from the place he had spoken, in the place where he had spoken, and here in the place where God had spoken to him. Emphasizing the direct relationship here. And I would like to highlight that, especially after we went through the very difficult chapter 34 where God was not there at all, and we saw how the recollection of Jacob having been fleeing when he was not turning to God. And since the whole issue in chapter 34 is about him not listening and remembering the promise to go back and settle in Beersheba, or in the renewed one at the beginning of this chapter, the word from God in Bethel, there's a repetition here of God is speaking to Jacob. There's no question about he's speaking to him. And here's where we see Jacob's response. So in verse 14. So Sarna notes the drink offering is added, but notice how that's exactly parallel or the pouring oil rather is exactly parallel to 28:18. The drink offering is what's added here. If we just go back to 28:18 for a moment, we can see there he arose early and took the stone and put it under his head and set it up for a pillar and poured oil on top of it. And here it's a pillar, and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on top of it. But of course, that's in a very different context than it was in 28. And chapter 28 is not after the wrestling scene. In chapter 28 is after the angels coming down and going back up on the road that we saw, where God was in this place, which was Bethel, and he didn't know it. And that's exactly what happens here. So Jacob called the place where God had spoken with him Bethel. And again, we have to ask, is this recalling that, or is this saying this is being done twice? It certainly seems unlikely that we're supposed to understand that Jacob has twice called the place Bethel and twice set up a pillar there and poured oil on it. I'd suggest that this is simply recalling the story to provide a closure to the story of Jacob's journey, other than this little epilogue here that we'll see next time about the birth of his final son, Benjamin. See you for that next time. Bye-bye.